Hi, my name is Brittany and I make snails. And today I'm going to be making a snail based off of a delicious strawberry. So, of course, before I get started, we've got to do a little bit of research and check out some resource material. Pictures are great, but when you have the real thing right in front of you, it's even better. Really looking at how those seeds are kind of dimpled into the surface of the strawberry, and I also thought it would be really cool to make the underside of the snail kind of reflect the inside of the strawberry, almost like it's cut in half itself. Strawberries themselves are a little bit translucent. They're not, super heavy and opaque. They do allow a little bit of light to shine through, so I thought it would only be fitting to use some translucent polymer clay for this project. One of the unfortunate downsides of that, however, is that it is extremely difficult to keep clean. So I am going to wear gloves for most of the process. I'm also going to make sure that I'm constantly cleaning my materials and surfaces and anything that I use to try and keep little, lint particles and hairs and fibers and pigment transfer to an absolute minimum. And typically I would be painting the snail, but for this particular one, in order to try and get that translucent effect as accurate as possible, I'm going to actually be using some powdered pigment to color the snail. So it's extra important that I keep all of those little dusty bits to a minimum because they will absolutely show through. And I won't be able to rely on paint to cover it up. So any sort of dirt on my tools like this, I have to really keep an eye out for and make sure that I clean. It'd be great if I just kept my stuff clean all the time, but I'm a little bit lazy, which is fine. So to start off with, I'm going to make the sort of shell for the snail, which is not going to be a shell at all, but instead it's going to be also a strawberry. So I'm mapping out sort of the spiral that I want it to have because I want it to all look like one cohesive creature, not just a snail that is a strawberry, but a strawberry snail. So I've kind of mapped out the spiral, and then I'm going to use this coil just to add a little bit of extra definition. Sure, I could have gone through and sculpted it out and kind of carved it out of the shape, but it's just so much easier to just kind of make it and then blend it in. So that's what I did, keeping an eye out for any little dusty bits or little fuzzes along the way. And once I'm happy with the shape, I'm going to start making the dimples. Of course, this is going to be a bit tedious, but I promise you I've tried lots of shortcut ways and none of them give as realistic of an effect. So I just took my little ball tool, stuck it in there, and then kind of drug out the bottom edge to make it a little bit teardrop shaped. The nice thing about having an organic subject matter like this is that it doesn't have to be totally perfect. You got a little bit of wiggle room because nature's not perfect, and that's okay. So I stuck a big hole in the bottom of that for anchoring later, and now I'm going to start adding the powder pigment. These powder pigments are just soft chalk pastels that I've taken a blade and shaved off a fine powder from each color that I plan on using. I've found that keeping them in a little case like this is super handy dandy for saving the leftover bits for future projects. Of course, I'm trying to be super careful of where I get this pigment powder because even just a tiny little speck of it is going to show up and transfer and potentially cause issues down the line if I'm not really careful. But I'm basically just going to take this powder pigment on a makeup brush that can kind of densely hold all of those little powders and just kind of gently but firmly press it into the surface of the raw clay. I built up the colors from lightest to darkest, though depending on the project that may vary, but for this particular piece it's fairly simple. Now here you can see what I mean about those pigments really transferring. I'm going to show you real quick how I would clean that up. Just a Q-tip and a little bit of isopropyl alcohol in a circular motion while turning the Q-tip itself to kind of spin and lift those pigment powders off of the surface as I go. And then I can take the powder pigment that I wanted to be there and just press it back into the surface to fix it up. And there we go. Time to bake. Now that the shell's pretty much done, it's time to make a body for it to go on. The process is pretty much going to be the same as it was for the shell, just snail-shaped. So much the same as I do for many of the other snails. I'm going to make this kind of fat, wormy, snaky shape, hot dog maybe, and then kind of squish it and form it into a vaguely snail body shape. Now at this point I realized he was looking a little thicker than I want, but that's an easy fix. Just take a little trim off the top and the sides, no biggie. I actually had a sketch that I was working from for this one. I've been really trying to work on refining my idea before I start sculpting. In the past, I pretty much just kind of fly by the seat of my pants. So in trying to elevate my work, I'm trying to plan a little bit more ahead of time before I actually do the work. And so part of the process for me with this one was trying to get as close to that initial sketch as I could. Now I'm doing lots of new things with this particular snail. For the eyes, I'm still going to use my supportive wire like I always do and make sure that I have plenty of length to go down into the body to make them as strong as possible. But I'm actually not going to be coating them in clay for this particular snail. Since I'm going for a more naturalistic snail body look, I'm going to try to keep those eye stalks as thin as possible. And well, we'll get to it here in a minute. But first I'm going to clean up the bottom to smooth things out. I'm going to put my maker's stamp in the bottom of the snail. Just a little press and wiggle and it'll transfer very nicely. And now we can start working on the body texture. So I'm going for a more naturalistic look, and snails do have a sort of edge around the bottom of their body or the foot. And so I'm just going to kind of take my ball tool and roll to make this sort of ruffle pattern around the edge of the body of the snail. Check my fit to make sure I like the proportions before I do all of this dimpling work. And then just like I did for the strawberry shell, I'm going to do the strawberry body pretty much the same way. I'm just going to work my way up the body with the dimpling pattern and kind of fade it out a little bit as we get up closer to the head. Then I can start adding that pigment powder just like we did with the shell. I'm going to do pretty much the same thing, except I'm going to start from the bottom edge and work my way up. That way, as any pigment powders fall, thank you gravity, they will just land on areas that have already been densely packed, and the pigment powder on top can easily be brushed or blown off. So now that that body is totally colored, I can take my strawberry shell and make a nice little impression in the body for it to sit later on. This will kind of smush that clay out to the side and give it a more natural looking resting place once everything is put together. Now to give us a little extra pop and color to our design, we're going to add some little strawberry leaves. This is just going to be some light green clay that I'm going to squeeze into a sort of diamond shape and then take my silicone tipped tool to make some impressions, a couple little veins, pretty simple, and then I'm going to just kind of squeeze and press that little leaf into a more pointed shape how I want it. Once I have a bunch of those made, I can do the same process with some of that powdered pastel pigment and just kind of tamp it in around the edges to give a nice gradient effect to each of those leaves. Now our snail body is baked, so anytime we have baked clay combining with other clay, we're going to have that clay adhesive in between just to sandwich and make sure everything sticks really good. I'm going to also put some on the baked strawberry with a little extra clay to fill in that gap in the bottom, and then I'm going to give it a firm press to make sure everything is really stuck together. Take a little of that clay adhesive on the underside of each one of these leaves to press it and pose it into place to make sure they stay stuck where I want them. And then I'm going to do pretty much the same thing for a nice little leaf hat on the head of the snail, except I'm not going to use that clay adhesive, and you'll see just how much of a difference that makes with getting everything to stick properly. But in this case, I need those leaves to be able to pop off easily so that I can do what I'm going to do to make the eyes here in just a little bit. So once I've got that pretty much how I want it, I will bake that whole thing in the oven. And then now that he's nice and stiff, we're going to ever so gently pop his little hat off. Beautiful. Save that for later. And now we're going to try something new with these eye stalks. So I have some high temperature hot glue, and my thinking with this is that once it is cool and solidified, it will be quite heat resistant and also much more flexible and durable than coating the eye stalks in polymer clay like I normally do. Sometimes you gotta try new things and step out of your comfort zone. And this was definitely a bit tricky and tedious, but I do feel like I was able to get much thinner eye stalks, still get a nice blend into the body, and it will definitely be more durable. So we'll see. Now, of course, these don't have the same pigmentation as the body, and our pigment powder is not going to just stick. So what we're going to do is take some polyacrylic with those same pigment powders from before. That way it will be the exact same colors and shades, and add those to the eye stalks and tentacles where I need them. Now it's time to coat the entire body in that same polyacrylic. This will kind of seal all of those pigments in, because while they are stuck to the surface now, there is a little bit of transfer that will still happen. And if the body were to get scratched or dinged or scuffed up against something, that pigment powder would absolutely rub off. So we're going to make sure that everything is totally sealed, gives us a beautiful glossy shine. And then while that's drying, we're going to make the seeds. Now, don't ask me how many there were, because I don't know. I didn't count, because if I had, it probably would have made me feel crazy, but I just made as many as I could stand to make, just with a little tiny pinch of this light yellow clay squeezed into a sort of teardrop shape, and then baked them before attaching them to the body. For that attachment, I just used that same polyacrylic sealant, put a little bit in a few divots, and then placed each one of those little seeds all over the body. Any divot I could find, I stuck a seed in it. A few had to be, adjusted, because they didn't quite want to go to bed in their little cozy holes. And I have tried several methods of making strawberry seeds in the past, with like a stamp that's the divot and the seed all in one, or with making bigger seeds to make my life a little bit easier. But I'm telling you, the long, slow way is almost always the better way. It's just going to give you the best result. That time and patience is really worth it, and I think it turned out pretty great. So now that that is all pretty much dry, I'm going to do the same powder pigment with the polyacrylic on the bottom to try and get that strawberry interior look that we talked about before. Just some kind of little streaks and stripes going up the side to kind of give that appearance that the pigment continues a little bit into the body of the strawberry. And now we can finally attach his little hat. Since everything's dried and solidified, I just used a little bit of gel super glue to attach those pieces. And then once I was 100% sure that super glue was dry, I sealed that with polyacrylic as well, just to really wrap everything together, So next we're going to work on the slime, which is going to be UV resin. Like with everything else, I made sure to clean my surfaces before I got started. And we're just going to use UV resin with a teeny tiny little bit of red mica powder, just to give it a little bit of a pink cast when it shimmers in the light. Once I've got that mixed up the way I want, I start working on the first layer of UV resin on the front of the snail. Now, I wanted to make sure that I was able to get a thick enough coating for that mica powder to really shine. So I did a thin layer first, where I then placed the snail on the silicone mat to let gravity kind of do its job and pull some of that UV resin down to the bottom, kind of making a little foot to that front cavity there. That way I could then put a second layer of UV resin on the front of the snail, and I actually just held it in my gloved hand to cure. That way I could make sure that I got a nice thick coating where you could really see that mica powder on the front. For the bottom of the snail, it's pretty much the same as it generally is. I just poured out some of that UV resin on the bottom of the snail, and then made sure that I smoothed that out on the base with a popsicle stick to make sure every little bit of that base is completely coated before I smoosh it down on my silicone mat and try to make sure that I get the sort of general shape that I want for that slime trail base. Adding a little extra to the back to kind of beef it up. And then once that's cured, I decided that I wanted to go back and do a little bit of color adjustments to a couple of places on the snail. So I decided that I really needed the center of the strawberry to be a bit darker, and I had really wanted the kind of top of the strawberry, where the leaves are coming from, to be a bit more pale. So that the strawberry has kind of more of a gradation to it. You kind of see like a less ripened section and then a more ripened section. So not exactly the same as our reference strawberry at the beginning, but I think that the color variation really makes the shell a little more contrasting and just visually more interesting to look at than if it were just a flat red the whole way. I do wish that I kind of considered that and kept that more in mind when I was doing the pigment and everything, and just kind of left that area lighter. But that's part of learning when you're making things. Sometimes you make mistakes, sometimes you forget things or do things differently than you thought you would, and you just have to take that information and try and learn from it and utilize it better next time. With that said, I would love to know what you guys think about this snail and about this video, what you like, what you don't like, about the snail, the process, the video, anything. I'm always looking for feedback and would love to hear from you guys. Thank you so much for watching. You're awesome, and I will see you in the next video.